thing to say about the IACR Fellow, of course, I'm immensely proud to become an IACR Fellow, but eventually you run out of Chelsea's and Manchester Uniteds, and you start having to give awards to West Ham United, and you go to the kind of the middle of the Premiership, or even the bottom of the Premiership. So I know exactly where I stand in the hierarchy, but thank you for those kind words. Okay, so I'm going to talk about SSH, and this is unashamedly a crypto talk, but I actually am going to talk a little bit about software vulnerabilities and patching and the dangers of patching crypto code. So there's a little bit of kind of coding software in there as well, but I am a cryptographer, okay, and I'm proud to admit I'm a cryptographer, and I think you'll see quite a lot of crypto today, maybe a little bit in contrast to yesterday. So I have 45 minutes, I'm going to try and cover as much of this as I can. Obviously something's gone wrong on this slide, but I'll fix that later. So I'm going to talk about SSH, I'm going to talk about the measurement study we did, what we learned from that, talk about the security analysis that one can do of the different encryption modes in SSH. So I guess SSH doesn't really need very much of an introduction here. How many of you are using SSH? Okay, maybe I should ask it the other way around. Is anybody not using SSH? Is anybody not using SSH right now at this very moment to log into some remote machine somewhere? Okay, so it's a very important tool that we all rely on, and this is the Wikipedia page or part of the Wikipedia page. But SSH really hasn't had as much attention as other protocols have, like SSL TLS, for example. So we, way back in 2008, 2009, started looking at it, and it's one of those things that's been kind of rattling around in my head ever since as an interesting thing to come back to. And every time you come back to a complex protocol, you see new things and you learn new things about the cryptography there. And that's, I think, an important lesson in life is to not just think that you know everything the first time you encounter it, but to repeatedly revisit the topic. So what is SSH doing to your data? Well, this is how the symmetric encryption in SSH is working. So we're going to actually ignore the fact that some complicated key exchange protocol has taken place, and that some keys have been established, some cryptographic keys. We're going to assume that's all been done, and now we're looking at what happens to your username and password when you're entering them into an SSH session. So that's the payload that we want to protect, sequence of bytes. That data gets encoded in some way, so we have some padding, we have a packet length field, and so on. And then we apply an encryption algorithm to that, so think here of something like CBC mode of a block cipher, or maybe counter mode of a block cipher. This gives us our ciphertext. Notice that the sequence number hasn't been used yet. Notice also that this field, the packet length field, is actually being encrypted as part of the data. Okay, so when we see this sequence of ciphertext bytes on the wire going from a client to a server, there's no sort of metadata there. Like the length information is actually hidden, and that's a deliberate design decision by the SSH designers to hide as much data as possible about SSH packets. Of course, we want some kind of integrity protection. So what SSH does is it takes the sequence number and this encoded payload and puts it through a MAC algorithm. You can think here of HMAC as your MAC algorithm, and that gives us a MAC tag. And this is the data, the ciphertext concatenated with the MAC tag that is actually transmitted on the wire between a client and a server, maybe in a sequence of TCP segments, over IP. Okay? So this is all running over TCP IP at the application layer. So this is what's known as a stateful encode, then encrypt and MAC construction, which is a bit of a mouthful. So focus on the E&M part first. E&M means encrypt and MAC. There are three basic ways of combining an encryption scheme and a MAC algorithm to make a strongly secure encryption scheme. Sometimes you get strong security, sometimes you don't. And one of them is encrypt and MAC. The other two are MAC then encrypt, which is what SSL was using, and TLS until recently. And then the final one is MAC then encrypt. And actually, of those three things, the only one that's really generically secure is encrypt then MAC. So this encrypt and MAC construction, where you take the plaintext and you encrypt it, and then you also apply a MAC algorithm to the plaintext, is not really the best construction to use. It's, we say encode then encrypt then MAC because of the fact that the payload is also put in some data structure before the encryption is done. And we say it's stateful because here we have a sequence number, which is a 4-byte value, so 32-bit value, which is increasing by 1 for each packet that we send on an SSH connection. Okay, so every packet will get a new sequence number incorporated into the MAC computation. And this is important for preventing replay attacks and detecting the fact that the data might have been reordered by an attacker. Okay, so the packet length field here is a 4-byte value, 32 bits, and it's measuring the length of this data. So it's actually measuring the size of the padding length field, which is 1 byte, plus the length of the payload, plus the length of the padding. But it doesn't include itself. Do you see what I mean? It's not self-referential, okay? And it doesn't include the sequence number. So it's everything from here to the end of the plain text. Okay, good. And there's an RFC for this that describes various different modes and so on, how you can do this. There's also an RFC for counter mode, RFC 4344, for the corresponding block cipher. So you can use AES in counter mode. Okay, so a little bit of history about this. So this was, came into service in the late 90s, and then in 2002, some cryptographers got hold of this, Bellari, Kono, and Namprempere. They introduced a new security notion. Don't worry, this is the only heavy theory slide in the whole talk. After this, it's all just bits and bytes all the way down. So just for the moment, bear with me if you're not into theory. And so they developed this nice security model, a stateful security model, and they were able to prove something nice about SSH. In particular, the SSH in counter mode was secure, and also SSH in CBC mode was secure, as long as you used random initialization vectors for CBC mode, which is actually not what SSH was doing. SSH was doing chained initialization vectors, like in SSL v3 or something, or TLS 1.0. Okay, so then that was great. We get some nice validation. But unfortunately, in 2009, we, so myself and Martin Albrecht and Gavin Watson, produced an attack against SSH in CBC mode. And of course, the attack is outside of the security model. It's an attack that is just beyond the reach of the security model. So this is an important lesson for practitioners, I think, that if a cryptographer comes to you and says, I've proven it secure, you should say, show me your security model. Okay, and get them to explain to you why their security model captures all of the important attacks in practice. And probably pretty soon you'll have them admitting that it doesn't. So the attack exploited fragmented delivery in TCP/IP. And this is the idea that an attacker can take a small number of bytes and deliver it to an SSH implementation, say running on a server, and then see how the server reacts to that sequence of bytes, and then send another fragment and another fragment. And we'll come back to this attack in a few slides' time and talk about it in a little bit more detail. So at that time, the leading implementation of SSH was OpenSSH. They claimed to be about 80% of servers on the internet, and they released a patch to stop this specific attack. Okay, so we have an attack outside of the model, which invalidates the security proof, and then we have a patch for that specific attack, okay, but no security proof. In 2010, we decided that we should really see what we could prove in a more realistic security model. So we proved that actually SSH in counter mode is secure in an extended security model that captures this ability of the attacker to kind of deliver small amounts of ciphertext to a server. Okay, this kind of we called it fragmented ciphertexts. And then in 2012, you can see that I like to keep coming back to problems. We wrote another research paper. This one was published at Eurocrypt 2012. And we had kind of a general study of these kinds of encryption schemes supporting fragmented decryption, fragmented delivery and decryption of ciphertexts. Okay, and we came up with a new security notion in CFA security. And we also came up with some additional security properties that SSH seems to be trying to provide, but isn't really very successfully providing. In particular, this idea of boundary hiding. So if we go back to the picture for just one moment, here, the packet length field is encrypted. And so if you look at a sequence of packets, SSH packets, on the wire, you just get a sequence of chunks like this. And for the particular encryption schemes in use, that means that you, as an attacker, all you see is a long sequence of random bytes. You can't tell where one ends and the next begins. Okay, so imagine a bunch of these structures put back to back on a network, flowing across a network. It just looks like a long sequence of random bytes. Okay, so TLS is trying to, SSH is trying to achieve this kind of boundary hiding property. So you can't see where one ciphertext ends and the next one begins. So we modeled this too in our 2012 paper, and another property related to denial of service, which I guess we'll come back to later. I'll say more about it later. So that brings us up to 2015. That's where SSH stood. We had some attacks. We had some security proofs. There was, So in 2015, we decided to do a measurement study of SSH deployment. And the reason we did this is also sort of interesting. In the UK, our government assesses all of our research every 6 or 7 years. And one of the things they assess is impact. Did you change the world with your research? And we have to write these case studies explaining how we changed the world. Okay? It's a load of BS, but we have to do it, right? So we thought, well, maybe SSH would make a good case study, because we had this attack in 2009, and maybe things changed, right? Maybe you could see that less people were using CBC mode, more people were using counter mode or something. So we decided to start a measurement study, and that actually led to a whole sequence of things which led to this paper that Uri referred to in his introduction, published at CCS last year. So what did we do? We did 2 internet-wide scans. We used sort of standard tools for this, zgrab and zmap. We grabbed banners, and what we were really trying to find out is which algorithm does each SSH server on the internet prefer. We found about 2 to the 24 servers, so about 16 million servers that were responding to SSH connection requests in each of our 2 scans. We did 2 scans roughly 1.5 months apart. We were a bit surprised by that number. That means like 1 in every 256 hosts on the internet out of all 2 to the 32 IP addresses, IPv4 addresses, is running SSH. Okay, that's quite a lot of SSH servers. So what did we find? Here's some data about version numbers. And it's a little bit small if you're at the back. I did warn you to move forward. It's not too late to move if you want to move. What can you see here? Well, okay, lots of OpenSSH and lots of Dropbar. I didn't really know what Dropbar was when we started this research. Anybody here know what Dropbar is? A few of you? Good, good. So I'm ignorant and you're much better informed. So this is actually a kind of a small footprint implementation of SSH, which is very popular in embedded systems and home routers and so on. Okay? And actually, everything else adds up to less than 5% of what we could see on the internet. So 95% is OpenSSH and Dropbar. And you start to look at things like version numbers, and you see that, for example, 42% of Dropbar, that's like 8 million servers, roughly, is Dropbar, a 2014 version of Dropbar. And this is in late 2015. So there's a kind of time lag in new versions of Dropbar being distributed. Okay? Okay, now an interesting thing here is that nearly 1 million, well, nearly 900,000 of these servers are older than version 0.52 of Dropbar. And the reason that's significant is that it was only in 0.52 that counter mode was implemented. So prior to 0.52, the only mode of encryption was CBC mode, and that's vulnerable to a variation of our 2009 attack. So there's 900,000 servers out there that prefer a cipher suite which is broken, okay, out of 16 million that we found. That's not great. Okay, moving on, OpenSSH. And the first thing that struck me here is that the most popular version of OpenSSH is OpenSSH version 5.3, which was released in about 2009. This is ancient, an ancient version. Now, that doesn't mean it hasn't been patched, and this is probably dominated by the major Linux distros, so it's maybe not as big a disaster as it looks. But still, there's a lot of old SSH out there, OpenSSH out there. So what does this say? Oh yeah, okay, so this says, well, if you look carefully, about 166,000 of the servers are older than version 5.2 and prefer CBC mode, so potentially vulnerable to our 2009 attack directly against OpenSSH. Okay, so if you add those two numbers together, 900,000 plus 166,000, you get more than 1 million servers which are vulnerable to some version, which would prefer a cipher suite which is vulnerable to a known attack. Okay, I don't think that's very good. Okay, so moving forward, I think I've said all of this. Let's look at now the preferred algorithms by version. So let's look at OpenSSH and say, what algorithms did those servers say that they would prefer to use above anything else? And what you see here is there's a lot of counter mode, okay, but there's a lot of other stuff as well. And there's stuff in here that we didn't even know what it was, and we couldn't find any documentation for it. So for example, anything that ends, if I can get my laser pointer going, anything that ends ETM, okay, at. That's short for ETM at OpenSSH.com. And we didn't know what this was. And it turns out that in around 2013, 2014, the OpenSSH team decided to add their own EncryptionthenMac construction. That's great. They'd been paying attention to the literature, and they had seen that EncryptionthenMac was the most robust thing you could do, so they added it to their code base. Okay? But they didn't document it anywhere. They just added it to the code base. Okay, we'll come back to that. And if you count, it turns out there's 155 different combinations that are preferred by at least one server on the internet. Now, many of them, it's a very, very small number of servers, but still, that's a lot of diversity. I think a little bit of crypto diversity is a good thing. I think a lot of crypto diversity is not necessarily a good thing. Okay, so there's lots of counter mode, followed by CBC. There's lots of this ETM thing. There's a little bit of ChaChaxx 20 poly 1305. And that's actually now the default in OpenSSH since version 7 point something or 6 point something. So you would expect to see this going up in the figures eventually. But right now, or back in 2015, 2016, it was running at about 1.7%. And a tiny amount of GCM. You can use AES GCM as well. I didn't describe how to do that, but it's also available. Okay, what about Dropbar? Well, as you would expect from a small footprint implementation, there's much less diversity, there's much fewer algorithms supported, and actually 90% of it is counter mode, for which we have a pretty good security analysis. And there's no exotic options, there's no GCM, there's no poly ChaChaxx, etc., etc. The problem is, though, all of the CBC modes remain unpatched against our 2009 attack. You need to tweak the attack a little bit, but it's not rocket science to do it. So 8% of that total are vulnerable to that old attack. Okay, so that gave us some food for thought, some useful data. Things did change. There's more counter mode than there used to be, but there's still a lot of CBC mode around. So our reaction to that is to say, well, let's break CBC mode again. Okay? Then try and get rid of it. Let's try and get rid of it. So there was a patch, and we would need to break through that patch somehow. So let me talk about how we did that. This is an attack on the patched CBC mode in OpenSSH. So we're getting pretty specific now, but this is what you have to do. You have to look at specific implementations and show how they can be broken in order to move the state of the art forward. Okay, so remember this picture. This is how the EncryptionthenMac construction works. Now let's think about decryption. Because this is running over TCP/IP, it's perfectly possible under normal operations that a ciphertext will be fragmented across several TCP packets. Okay, and so the processing of these chunks has to be done in a kind of online manner as they're arriving at the server or at the client. Let's just say at the server. Okay, so these chunks are arriving in a sequence of packets and so on. And the question is, how do you do the decryption of the incoming packet sequence? The incoming sequence of ciphertext fragments. Okay? First thing is, well, you'd like to check a MAC on the plaintext eventually, so you'd better recover the plaintext. You don't even know how long the plaintext is meant to be, because the length field was encrypted. Okay? So what are you going to do? Maybe I'll let you think about that for a second. How are you going to handle the decryption here? Any suggestions from the audience? Maybe it's a bit early in the morning and, you all have Kopfschmerzen. Nach dem Bieren. Okay. Well, let's think about it. Here's what happens in OpenSSH prior to version 5.2. So this is back in 2008. What you have to do is you get the first block of the first fragment that arrives, and you say, okay, that's where my length field is going to be. Okay, here's the packet length field at the front. So this first chunk here, if it's long enough to contain a complete block, say of CBC mode encryption or counter mode encryption, I could decrypt that block and get the packet length field out. And now I have the packet length field. Now I know how many bytes I should accept. I can do the arithmetic. I can take the length field, its value, and plus the size of the MAC, and that will tell me how many bytes I need. Okay, I have to adjust by 4 because remember the packet length field itself was not included in the value in the packet length field, right? It was not self-referential. Okay, so you have to decrypt something. You have to decrypt before you've authenticated this data and act on that data. Okay, now that should be setting some alarm bells ringing in your minds. Okay, so then we wait until that many bytes have been received, and now finally we've got enough plaintext that we think we've got enough plaintext that we can interpret what comes next as the MAC value and then verify the MAC. Okay, and that's really the only way you can do it. because of the way this thing has been built. So here's the attack from our paper in 2009. Let's take a target ciphertext block. That can be any block at all from a sequence of packets that went past on the wire. The one that contains your password. Okay, think of it as being that one. It's a sensitive ciphertext block. It's a block that we would like to try to decrypt. And let's inject it into the stream in such a way that it's interpreted as the first block of a new packet. Okay, so the packet goes quiet for a while. The connection goes quiet for a while. That means we know there's no transmission going on. Let's send our block now. So it gets interpreted by the receiver as if it was the first block of a new SSH packet. Although what that means is that the receiver will decrypt it using some initialization vector. This will actually be the last block of the previous ciphertext. Okay, it's known to the attacker. And it will then treat the first 4 bytes of the plaintext as the length field. Okay, so this block here, I want to emphasize, was not a block that contained a length field. It contained your password. But it's interpreted as if it contained a length field by the decryption process. Is it clear? Okay, now what happens next? The attacker will now just send in random blocks. Quatsch. Okay? Hier kommt die Quatsch. Okay, gut, so weiter. Okay, now at the end, finally, enough data has arrived that the receiver says, okay, what comes next must be the MAC. Let me check the MAC. Okay, so here comes the MAC, and the MAC will fail because we injected garbage here. So this is garbage plaintext. The MAC will fail, and an error message will be sent, and the connection will be terminated. Okay, and the question for you as the audience, how many bytes do we have to send in to cause the MAC to fail? Yes? Right, it corresponds to the value here, with a little bit of arithmetic, right? +4, -4 or something, okay? There's a little bit of arithmetic going on. Okay, so now you see the attack, I think. Some of you do anyway. Okay, so the number of bytes that are needed to cause this decryption process to terminate, to end, is determined by something in the very first block here. But that's related to the true decryption of CI star. Okay, so we have to play this game where we say, well, we can learn this orange value now from observing the decryption process. What we really want to know is this green value, where we actually, instead of having the IV here, we actually had the previous ciphertext block, because that's the real decryption process that would give us the green block. But now we just use arithmetic. We use XORs, and this is the basic property of CBC mode, that somehow you can play this game of saying, well, this value XORed with the IV would give you a value coming out of here, out of the decryption of this is the block cipher decryption, and we'd have to get the same value over here because we're applying the block cipher decryption to the same ciphertext block. So this XOR equation must hold. And you can rearrange this equation to recover the green field. Okay? So you've recovered 4 bytes of plain text from an SSH connection. Not bad, huh? Good. And it's only 4 bytes, but SSH was meant to be bulletproof, right? You were using it to protect your ultra-sensitive password for logging into your server. So this is a bit of a disaster. So that's back in 2009. Actually, the real attack's a little bit more complicated. Very, very briefly, we actually sanity check this length field before we go any further. So as soon as we, going back to the, let's not go back to the picture, it'd take too long, but as soon as we decrypt that first block of ciphertext, we're going to check, are those first 4 bytes sensible? Do they make sense? And what OpenSSH was doing was checking this value lay between 5, which is the absolute minimum value it could have because of padding, and 2 to the 18. It's a 32-bit field, so the kind of maximum value it could be would be 2 to the 32 minus 1. And they're saying, well, we're going to make sure it's no larger than 2 to the 18. Okay? And the RFC says you should check that the length field is reasonable. It doesn't define what reasonable means, but it says you should check it's reasonable. And this is how OpenSSH interpreted that. And you also do a kind of a modularity check. So, you know, this is CBC mode. So everything should be a multiple of the block size. And that gives you a second arithmetic condition. Okay, BL here stands for block length. Think of 16 there, okay, for AES. So these 2 tests that you do. But what's funny is that each of these checks, if it fails, will produce a different error message. So this thing is leaking more information through these error messages, and these are all distinguishable by the attacker. I won't go through the details of it, but this is nirvana for a cryptanalyst, right? This is happy days. Okay, and then if and only if both of these tests pass, OpenSSH will sit and wait for more bytes, and then it will perform the MAC check, and then it will produce yet a third error message. So you can always tell these different conditions apart. Okay, so when you put it all together, including this extra stuff, you don't quite recover 4 bytes with probability 1. What you recover is 4 bytes, or 32 bits, with probability 2 to the minus 18. Because basically, these two tests together, they pass with probability about 2 to the minus 18 for random blocks. And you can do better if you have partially known plaintext, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's the attack from 2009. What was the patch? What did OpenSSH do? Here's what they do. Instead of sending an error message if the length checks fail, what the code was changed to do was to say, well, okay, something's gone wrong. Don't send an error message now because that leaks information. Let's wait a while. Let's wait until 2 to the 18 bytes have arrived on the network, okay, and then check a MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes. So now you're not leaking the fact that the length field test has failed in any way. And then the other path is if those pass, you'll receive a certain number of bytes as indicated by the length field. If that failed before, you would get a MAC error, and that was the kind of third error message that you could tell. So instead of now sending that error message, what you do is, again, you wait until 2 to the 18 bytes have arrived, and then you check a MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes. So now you see that in either case, you're going to wait until a set number of bytes have arrived, and then, and only then, you're going to check the MAC. So these kind of error messages are no longer available to the adversary. You have a single error message, which will always be a MAC failure, and that's not leaking anything. Jörg. So both of these paths slow down SSH a lot, because anytime something goes wrong, SSH is now going to wait until 256 kilobytes have arrived on the network. And if you're in an interactive session, that's a lot of typing you have to do to generate that much traffic on the network, okay? So this relates to this property of denial of service. By flipping a single bit in the packet, the attacker can make the receiver hang, can make it wait for up to 2 to the 18. So this fix is not a good fix from the point of view of denial of service, again, for an active attacker. Is that the point you were making? Yeah, but it's even worse than that. So let's see how it's even worse, but that's a great point. So, and that relates to that property of denial of service that I was talking about way back at the beginning, okay? So this is trivially vulnerable to denial of service attacks, where the client is just sitting thinking, well, my connection hasn't terminated, but nor is anything happening at the server, okay? So no error message is ever sent until 2 to the 18 bytes of ciphertext have arrived, and the question is this a good patch? Well, obviously not, right? I've set it up so that it's not a good patch, but I mean, this is what they did. And this bugged me for years, actually. And we never really sat down and analyzed it until we did that measurement study and we saw that CBC was still out there. And we thought, well, it's time to go back and look at this again. What can we see? So here's the problem. Here is a MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes. And that's the only MAC you compute. Here, there's a MAC that's done here for the MAC verification, and then another MAC down here after you receive all 2 to the 18 bytes. So you actually have 2 MAC verifications going on here. Okay? One on LF bytes, the length field, roughly speaking, and one on 2 to the 18 bytes. So now you see there's a difference in the amount of computation that you do in the 2 paths. Now the attack is pretty obvious, I think. So here's the picture. Georgia, I'm sorry we stole your artwork again. Okay. This is beautiful pictures done by Georgia Azura-Marson, who's in the audience. Thanks for coming. Okay, so here's Alice sending her data to the server, and here's the attacker injecting some ciphertext block. So here's what we do in the attack. We send 2 to the 18 bytes minus 1 block very quickly to the server. Okay? And when we time how long it takes for the MAC error to come back. And there's basically 2 paths. There's a slow path and a fast path. And on the slow path, the sanity checks both passed. And then we did a MAC on LF bytes and another MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes. And on the fast path, we only did a MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes. So if you can send all of these bytes quickly enough, to the server, so the server has them all to do its processing, then what you get in the timing signal is basically how long it takes to compute a MAC on LF bytes. But that depends on the size of LF. So you have leakage again. Okay? You cannot get exactly the value of LF, but you can get maybe everything except the 4 least significant bits or the 6 least significant bits of the length field, just by timing how long it takes for this MAC error to come back. Okay? So the attack is basically reanimated. Okay? Now, instead of being an attack where you feed in one block at a time and you observe for the error message, now you send all of the data quickly, and then you do a timing analysis. And the timing signal is actually gigantic. So in the Lucky 13 attack that Uri mentioned, we're able to time one HMAC compression function remotely over a network. Here, we're timing a MAC on some large number of bytes, up to 2 to the 18 bytes. Okay, so here the timing signal in principle is something like 1,000 times bigger than in the Lucky 13 attack. This is actually an easy signal to observe, even over many hops. Okay, so how did they patch this? So we disclosed this to the OpenSSH team. They thought about it for a while. They talked to us a little bit. And here's what they did. Okay? So we still do this up here. We do a MAC check on 2 to the 18 bytes. And down here, we want to wait until 2 to the 18 bytes have arrived and check. What we were doing was checking a MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes. And the problem was that we had already checked a MAC up here. So let's try to equalize things. Let's instead check a MAC here on 2 to the 18 minus LF bytes. And then here we've got a MAC on LF bytes and a MAC on 2 to the 18 minus LF bytes. So that's roughly equivalent to doing a MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes, which is what we have up here. So there's a chance that we've equalized the timing by doing this. And this is what we said they should do. We recommended this in our research paper, and they implemented it. So is this a good patch? So hands up if you think this is a good patch, because now we've taken away the timing signal, right? Everybody's very nervous. One guy, one brave person, good on you. Who thinks it's a bad patch? One person, Hanno at the back. Hanno's been paying a lot of attention to the OpenSSH mailing list, I think. Okay, so it turns out this is not a good patch, and we made a mistake. And that mistake, unfortunately, got propagated to the OpenSSH codebase. Let me explain why. Here now is another attack. Okay? Instead of sending 2 to the 18 minus the block size bytes, we send just 1 byte less. And we don't have to do it quickly anymore. We just do it at our leisure. Okay? And then we wait a few seconds, and then we send 1 more byte. So eventually, and we've also sent this first block here, as in all the previous attacks. So the total amount of data that's being sent is 2 to the 18 bytes, but it's staggered in such a way that the final MAC check cannot be done until this last byte has arrived. Now let's think about that final MAC check. Okay, and then we time how long it takes for the MAC error message to come back. Now let's think about it, okay? Actually, it's reversed now. I'm going to do that again. My student made this slide, and it's really great to see these animations. There we go. Thanks, Torben, for doing this. And if you look very carefully at what's happening now, okay, we've got a MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes. We've got a MAC on LF bytes plus a MAC on 2 to the 18 minus LF bytes. This is the thing that you do last in the 2 different cases. But this one is done during the wait step here. Okay? It's done during normal processing, whereas this one isn't done until the very end in this timing interval here. So again, we've got a timing attack. Right? There's a timing difference between a final MAC on 2 to the 18 bytes and a final MAC on this many bytes. Okay? So by making that change, actually we made things worse. Because it's no longer necessary to inject all of these bytes quickly. You just have to inject the right number of bytes and then wait for a second. Jörg?
We have to wait. Last byte to arrive.
Yes. Because what you want to do is you want to allow normal processing to happen if the length field's passed. And that's why you wait here for a few seconds. A few milliseconds, actually, is sufficient. Okay? But you don't want the last MAC check to be triggered until you're ready to time it. So sending the last 1 byte here gives you the opportunity to say, OK, now start my clock. Because what I know is that that last MAC check will only be done after this single byte here is injected, and not before it. It can't be. And that gives you the opportunity to detect the difference here in this box and in this box. Okay?
Makes things worse.
Almost certainly. Almost anything you do makes it worse. That's what I learned from this whole exercise. Yes. Okay? Maybe it's getting hard to follow now, and I understand that. This is quite tricky stuff. Okay? We didn't see it until quite late. Okay, so this is us accepting our Best Paper Award at CCS last year, and here's me thinking, I think we got away with it, right? But wrongly, as it turns out. Okay, so we told the OpenSSH team about the first attack, the first one I showed you already, and we worked very closely with them. They were actually very happy for us to talk about it anyway, because it turned out that they weren't, they had already deprecated CBC mode quite heavily in their code. They added those countermeasures that we suggested. Then we told them that actually those countermeasures were no good. And we told them also about some other issues, some very subtle byte counting issues. So they had an off error. The number of bytes they were counting wasn't exactly right. And in OpenSSH 7.5, they fixed this subtle byte counting issue, the really subtle error, but they didn't actually fix this last attack that I just showed you, okay? Because it's essentially impossible to fix. They could have reverted back to the previous thing, but there would still have been a timing attack. So they're kind of in an impossible situation. This thing is kind of fundamentally broken, okay? So the last bullet point there says, several residual issues still remain, and that's code for saying, actually, the OpenSSH in CBC mode is still vulnerable to quite a nasty attack that will recover plain text. But to be fair to OpenSSH, as I mentioned, they've been steadily getting rid of CBC mode. For example, it was disabled by default in OpenSSH 6.7. They haven't yet removed it completely from the code base, so you can still switch it on if you really want to. Okay. Good. So what else have we been doing in this paper? So there was the attack, and then there's this other work that didn't make it into the paper because we were too stupid. We also tried to prove security of some different modes. So we had this 199 different cipher suites being used. We thought we'd better analyze some of that and see if we could prove security results about it. I'm going to go rather quickly now because I've just been given the 5-minute signal by Uri. So there's lots of things that have been introduced. I mentioned GCM. Here, the length field is no longer encrypted. And actually, that's a sensible decision, because as we saw, encrypting length fields gets you into trouble. Okay? But instead now it's treated as associated data in the GCM construction. Then they added this generic EncryptionthenMac construction. Again, the length field is not encrypted, but it's integrity protected by the Mac. And then there's ChaChaxx 20 poly 1305 in version 6.5, and became the default in 6.9. And it actually encrypts the length field again. So it's clear to me that the designers of OpenSSH, or at least the OpenSSH development team, are really keen to hide the length field. They really want to prevent as much traffic analysis as possible. Okay, let's remind ourselves of this again. This is the naive construction. Here's the generic EncryptionthenMac construction. So it's what you would expect. You encrypt, but now the packet length is in the clear, and then you MAC all of that, incorporating the sequence number. So this is pretty good cryptographically. You could prove nice security results about this, and we did in our paper. Okay, AES GCM is working more or less the same way, and now the packet length field is in the clear. Unfortunately, they got it wrong. How can you get EncryptionthenMac wrong, right? I mean, it's like the simplest thing possible. Well, here's the code. Can you see the problem? Let me help you. Here is the MAC computation. Okay, once all the data has arrived, let's check the MAC. But it's not checking the MAC, it's computing the MAC. Okay, so it's computing the MAC value on the received ciphertext. Then we decrypt by calling something called ciphercrypt. It's not very helpful, but anyway, okay. So we've computed a MAC, now we decrypt, and then finally we check that the MAC is correct. So the MAC check is done after the decryption, even though the MAC was computed on the ciphertext and could have been and should have been checked as soon as the ciphertext was all available. Okay? This is not good. This does lead to possibly to attacks. So if you think about it, if there was in this code here some kind of padding oracle, then because the MAC check is only done afterwards, the padding oracle could be triggered by an attacker. Okay? It turned out that in the code, there was no such problem. But there could have been. This is an unsafe way to implement EncryptionthenMac in general. And the reason is that they wanted to reuse this code here from the EncryptionthenMac construction. This is legacy code, and they retrofitted EncryptionthenMac into the existing code path. Okay, instead of creating a separate code path for the EncryptionthenMac construction. So this here, and the point is that with EncryptionthenMac, you can only check the MAC once you have the plaintext. So you can only check the MAC after the decryption, right? That's why it ends up there. That's pretty horrible. Okay, and this was fixed in OpenSSH 7.3, so we disclosed it to the OpenSSH team, and they fixed this as a bug too. Here's the ChaChaxx construction, just to frighten you or maybe wake you up. My God, what's going on? It's kind of strange. So we encrypt the packet length field, and we encrypt the payload, but we do it using two separate ChaChaxx instances, using two separate keys, K1 and K2. Here we're deriving some kind of key for a Poly 1305 MAC algorithm to get a MAC tag, and we send C1, C2, and the MAC on the wire. Okay, so this is getting quite complicated. Let me just skip through this. Okay, and here's the key thing. We're encrypting the length field again. Do I have an attack because there's an encrypted length field? No. This is secure, and in our paper, we actually, using an extension of our existing security models, we're able to prove that it is secure, at least within the confines of our security model. And the reason it's okay is that really this is a kind of counter mode encryption inside ChaChaxx, and now you can't play these cut and paste games with blocks. If you try to move a block from one place to another, the decryptions are completely unrelated to each other. So all of those cut and paste attacks go away. And you can formally prove that that's okay. Okay, so that's really what this slide is saying. It says that we prove the security of these different modes. So here's a table summarizing our kind of formal security analysis. Lots of ticks and lots of crosses. And what you see in this first column is that if you want security against these kind of chosen fragment attacks, like the ones we used in the attack work, you can't get security for CBC mode, and you can't really get security for kind of fixed CBC mode either. Okay, that's what that kind of long sequence of attacks shows you. But the other modes do achieve kind of CCA security in this fragmented setting. All of the modes give you integrity because of the use of a MAC. Some of them, but not all of them, give you this boundary hiding property. And the reason that the EncryptionthenMac and the GCM constructions do not give you boundary hiding is that they have the plaintext field, sorry, the length field in the clear to enable the decryption to be done. And if you can see length fields, then you can certainly see where the boundaries are between packets, because you can just measure the number of bytes between. Okay? So you can't get that prevention of traffic, passive traffic analysis based on lengths that you might hope for. Interestingly, none of the constructions achieve boundary hiding against chosen fragment attackers, so this is like a chosen ciphertext setting, and nor do they achieve any kind of denial of service resistance. They all have this problem that an attacker who can flip a single bit in the ciphertext stream can cause a connection to hang. Okay? So none of these constructions achieve these kind of strongest security notions that you might want beyond the standard confidentiality and integrity properties. Okay, so coming to some concluding remarks, I hope that we've developed, and I hope I've conveyed to you that we have developed a better understanding of all of the different encryption modes that OpenSSH and SSH more generally is supporting. We've done this measurement study, we found new attacks on CBC mode, and we did security analysis for the other main modes that are out there, really carefully characterizing what kind of security you can hope to get from them. None of the schemes in use today possesses all of the properties that you might want. You can get strong integrity, you can get good confidentiality properties, but these more advanced properties like prevention of traffic analysis and resistance to denial of service are not achieved. But we can get them. So in our 2012 paper, there's a scheme called InterMac, which is basically encrypting and macking little chunks of data and processing them in chunks as they arrive. Okay? So you have some overhead because you have extra MACs, but it does achieve all of these security properties. So if you want them, you can get them. And what we're doing right now is actually writing code and prototyping it and measuring its performance based on this InterMac scheme from our 2012 paper. Okay, and we hope to, if you look very carefully, you can find our code on GitHub. You have to know what to search for. I guess InterMac would be a good search term. And we plan to write this up as a paper and talk about the whole development process and talk about what kind of security we can get for SSH at what cost, okay, because it's not completely for free. Okay, if you're interested in reading further, here's some papers that you might want to look at. And I guess the place to start is probably the last paper, which you can find online at the CCS website. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.